In Western Europe, in North America, the biggest cause of premature death is smoking. Premature death, I mean death before the age of 70. When people finally understood the relationship between smoking and death, there were two things that were surprising about it. One was that the risk was so big, but the second was that you needed to do two things to get that big risk. You needed to start early and keep smoking. So if you didn't start early in adult life, then you probably wouldn't have a very big risk. If you stopped smoking before you got some serious disease, then you wouldn't have such a big risk. But if you start smoking in adult life and you keep on smoking, then most people who do that eventually get killed by their tobacco. Because at every age, the death rates among smokers of that age are about 3 times as great as the death rates among non-smokers of that age. So 2/3 of the mortality among the smokers wouldn't be happening if they had the non-smoker death rates. And most of that difference is actually caused by smoking. Most of it is from diseases. Most of the excess risk is from diseases such as cancer of the lung, cancer of the mouth and throat, emphysema, heart attacks, strokes, bladder cancer, diseases that can actually be caused by smoking. So this is a cause and effect relationship. And what does this mean in terms of lifelong survival? Just an average smoker, those who get killed by it and those who don't, would be losing something like 10 years of life on average. And when people are going to die, well, they'll get illnesses before they die. That's true of non-smokers, it's true of smokers. And is the amount of illness very different? Not very different. So if we're dying 10 years earlier, if the smokers are dying 10 years earlier, then what they're losing on average is 10 good years of life. So they're losing 10 healthy years of life. So it's a big difference. And in Western Europe now, in North America now, this is still the biggest cause of premature death, and a few decades ago it used to be much worse. Because of this strange relationship between smoking and death, where you've got to both start early and keep smoking, it means that there's a long delay between when the young, first the young men and then maybe the young women in the population start to smoke, and the time when you see a lot of deaths from smoking. Because when the young start to smoke, it's going to take them 50 years to reach age 70. So it's going to be half a century before you're seeing the main hazard at age 70. But if you get a big cessation, if you get widespread cessation in a country, then you can get decreases within just 1 or 2 decades. So when there's widespread cessation, the death rates go down quite quickly. But when there's widespread uptake by young people, it takes half a century or more to see the full epidemic increase. And so although in Britain and America, the men started smoking around about the time of the First World War, in the first few decades of the century, it wasn't until the middle of the century, or even 1970, that we were seeing the full risks among men, first in Britain, then in the United States. Back in 1970, British men had the worst death rates in the entire world from smoking. We'd started smoking early in the 20th century, so the worst affected generation was the men born in 1900. And so by 1970, they were 70 years old. And so we got the world's highest death rates in smoking among 70-year-olds and throughout middle age. So if you said, what's the chances that a man in Britain is going to die in middle age? Well, at 1970 death rates, it was 41%. 41% of the men were dying in middle age. That's from age 35 to age 70. And 19 of those 41 deaths, pretty well half of those deaths, were from smoking. What about the 21st century? Well, what's happened is that smoking is now spread throughout the world. In China now, you'd have something like 60% of the young men become smokers. Worldwide, 50% of all young men become smokers, and 10% of all young women. So something like 30% of the young adults in this world become smokers now. That means we've got about 100 million new adults a year, so that's 30 million new smokers a year. Are they going to stop? Well, mostly not on current smoking patterns. If 30 million young adults begin smoking every year, and most of them don't stop. We'll finish up with more than 20 million young adults who begin smoking and keep on smoking throughout adult life. Now that's the pattern of tobacco consumption that we're now seeing. Well, if you start early and you keep on smoking, then you've got at least a 50% chance it's going to kill you. So we're going to have more than 10 million tobacco deaths every year eventually when the young adults of today reach late middle age, old age. So in the second half of this century, we're going to have something like 100 million tobacco deaths per decade, 10 million per year, 100 million per decade, somewhat more than 100 million per decade if we keep on. And if the women start to smoke in large numbers, it could be worse. So in the 21st century, we're going to have about 1 billion tobacco deaths if we keep on the way we are, with 30% of the young adults becoming smokers and most of them not stopping. We need to have widespread cessation by young adults. If we don't get that, then these hundreds of millions of tobacco deaths are going to happen. So this century, we're going to see a big increase in the number of deaths from smoking, partly due to the maturing of the epidemic in developing countries, particularly among men in developing countries, and partly due to population growth. And that's what we're going to see if current smoking patterns persist. If smoking spreads from men to women, then it could be worse. Conversely, if a lot of the men who smoke manage to stop, then it could be better. The World Health Organization has called for a decrease of 1/3 in the prevalence of smoking. Actually, they say in the age standardized prevalence of smoking, so the prevalence of smoking among people of a given age, in middle age, by 2025. It could be done, but it can be done only if the world really takes this seriously, and I think only if there are appropriate price increases in cigarettes. If we don't use the weapon of price increase, then I don't think even a reduction of 1/3 in smoking by 2025 is available. We have to take price increases seriously, as well as many other anti-tobacco measures, particularly restricting advertising, restricting all the ways in which tobacco companies can themselves stimulate demand.